Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the next thrilling, exciting, amazing, shocking, remorseless, vilified, vindicated, ebullient and effervescent episode of the Reading Cow from Another World thing, bedtime stories thing, show that this is with the next amazing installment of the Anecdota of Procopius 24. We continue. Unjust treatment of soldiers. I must not pass over his treatment of the soldiers, over whom he appointed paymasters with instructions to hold out as much of their money as they found possible, on the understanding that 1/12 of what they thus collected was theirs. Their method each year was as follows. It was the regulation that different ranks in the army received different pay. The young and newly enlisted received less than those who had seen hard service, and advanced halfway up the list received more. And the veterans who should soon retire from the service had a still higher rating, so that they could live on their savings as private citizens, and when their span of life was complete might be able to leave some consolation to their families. In this way the soldiers step by step arose in rank as their older comrades died or retired, and each man's pay fitted his degree of seniority. But the paymasters forbade erasing from the lists of the names of soldiers who died, even when many perished together, as frequently happened in the constant wars. Nor did they fill the vacancies in the list, even after considerable time. The result of this was that the number of soldiers grew continually less, and those who survived their dead comrades were deprived of their proper advancement in rank and pay, while the paymasters handed over to Justinian the money that should have gone to these soldiers all this time. Tricky. Furthermore, they fined the soldiers for other personal and unjust reasons as a reward for the perils they underwent in the battlefield, on the charge that they were Greeks, as if none of that nation could be brave, or that they were not commissioned by the emperor to serve, even when they showed his signature to that effect, which the paymasters did not hesitate to question, or that they had been absent from duty for a few days. Later, some of the palace guards were sent throughout the whole Roman Empire to investigate how many on the military list were unfit for service, and some were relieved of their uniform for being old and useless, so that for the rest of their lives they had to beg their meals of the charitable in the public forum, exhibiting their tears and lamentations to passers-by, and the rest, lest they might suffer a similar fate, handed over their savings as a bribe, with the result that all the soldiers lost heart for their profession, were reduced to poverty, and had no further enthusiasm for campaigning. This was ruinous to the Romans and their authority in Italy, and the paymaster Alexander, sent thither, had the audacity to reproach the soldiers for their poor morale, while he exacted further money from the Italians on the pretext of punishing them for their negotiations with Theodoric and the Goths. The common soldiers, indeed, were not the only ones to be reduced to poverty and helplessness by these commissioners, for all the staff officers under the generals who had formerly been in high esteem were utterly impoverished and in danger of famine, as they had no money left with which to buy their customary provisions. These guys. Speaking of the soldiers reminds me to add further details. The Roman emperors hitherto had stationed large armies on all frontiers of the state to protect its boundaries, and particularly in the east to repel incursions of the Persians and Saracens. These border troops Justinian used so ill and meanly from the start that their pay became 4 or 5 years overdue. And when peace was declared between the Romans and Persians, these poor men, instead of sharing in the fruits of peace, were forced to contribute to the public treasury whatever was owed them, after which they were summarily discharged from the army. Thereafter the boundaries of the Roman Empire were unguarded, and the soldiers were left suddenly on the hands of charity. Another corps of not less than 3,500 other soldiers, originally mustered for the palace guard and called the scholars, had always received higher pay from the public treasury than the rest of the army. Originally they were chosen to this preferred company by special merit, from the Armenians, but from the time when Zeno became emperor, it was possible for anyone, no matter how poor or cowardly a soldier, to wear this uniform. Now, when Justinian came to the throne, this Justinian distributed the honor among a large number upon their paying him a considerable price for it. And when he saw there was no further possible vacancy, he enrolled 2,000 more, whom he called supernumeraries. When he himself took over the throne, he immediately disbanded the supernumeraries without giving them back any of the money they had paid him. This, however, is what he schemed with reference to the student corps. Whenever an army was about to be sent against Libya, Italy, or the Persians, he ordered them to pack for service with the regulars, though he knew well they were utterly unfit for the campaign, and they, trembling at the possibility of active service, surrendered their pay for the period of the war. The students had this unpleasant experience more than once. Also, Peter, during all the time he was master of offices, worried them daily with unheard of thefts. For he was a gentle seeming and unassuming man, but the biggest thief alive and simply bursting with sordid meanness. It was this Peter whom I mentioned before as responsible for the murder of Massalantha, Theodoric's daughter. There were also others in the palace guard of much higher rank, and the more they paid into the treasury for their commissions, the higher was their military rating. These were called domestics and protectors and had always been exempt from active service. Only as a matter of form, they were listed in the palace guard. Some of them were regularly stationed in Constantinople. Others had always been assigned to Galatia or other provinces. Justinian scared these, too, in the same way into forfeiting their pay to him. Finally, it was the law that every 5 years the emperor should give each soldier a bonus of a fixed sum in gold, and every 5 years commissioners had been sent over all the Roman Empire to give each soldier 5 gold staters. Not to comply with this custom was simply unthinkable. Yet from the time this man managed the state, he never once did this, nor had any idea of doing it, though he reigned for 32 years, so that the very custom was finally forgotten by everyone. 25. How he robbed his own officials. I will next describe another way in which he robbed his subjects, those who served the emperor and the magistrates in Constantinople, either as guards or as secretaries or whatnot, are inscribed last in the list of officials. As time goes on, their rank advances, as their superiors die or retire, and they replace them, until they reach the topmost dignity. Those who attained this highest rank, according to the long-established rule, were paid more than 100 gold centenaries a year, so as to have competence for their old age, and that they might be able to discharge their many debts, which resulted in the affairs of state being competently and smoothly managed. But this emperor deprived them of nearly all this money, to the great harm of these officials and everybody else, for poverty, attacking them first, soon spread to the others who formerly shared their solvency, and if one could calculate the sums of money thus lost during 32 years, he would know of how great a total they were thus deprived. This is how the tyrant used his military aids. What he did to merchants and sailors, artisans and shopkeepers, and through them to everybody else, I will now relate. There are 2 straits on either side of Constantinople, one in the Hellespont between Sestos and Abydos, and the other at the mouth of the Euxine Sea, where the Church of the Holy Mother is situated. Now, in the Hellespontine Strait, there had been no custom house, though an officer was stationed by the emperor at Abydos, to see that no ship carrying a cargo of arms should pass to Constantinople without orders from the emperor, and that no one should set sail from Constantinople without papers signed by the proper officials, for no ship was allowed to leave Constantinople without permission from the bureau of the Master of Offices. The toll exacted from the ship's owners, however, had been inconsequential. The officer stationed at the other strait received regular salary from the emperor, and his duty was exactly the same, to see that nothing was transported to the barbarians dwelling beyond the Euxine that was not permitted to be sent from Rome to hostile territory, but he was not allowed to collect any duties from navigators at this point. But as soon as Justinian became emperor, he stationed a custom house at either strait, under 2 salaried officials, to whom he gave full power to collect as much money as they found possible. Eager to show their zeal, they made the mariners pay such tributes on everything as pirates might have exacted, and this was done at both straits. At Constantinople, he concocted the following scheme. He appointed one of his intimates, a Syrian named Attius, in charge of the port, with orders to collect duty from the ships anchoring there, and he accordingly never allowed any of the vessels putting in to Constantinople to leave until their owners either paid clearance fees or submitted to taking a cargo for Libya or Italy. Some of the ship owners, however, refused to submit to this compulsion, preferring to burn their boats rather than sail at such a price, and considered themselves lucky to escape with this sacrifice. Those who had to continue sailing in order to live, on the other hand, charged merchants 3 times the former rate for carrying their wares, so that the merchants had to recoup these losses by selling their stuff to individual purchasers at a correspondingly high price, with the result that the Romans nearly died of starvation. This was the state of affairs throughout the empire. I must not omit, I suppose, to mention of what the rulers did to the petty coinage. Formerly, the money changers had customarily given 210 obols, or foals, for 1 gold stater, but Justinian and Theodora, as a scheme for their private profit, ordered that only 180 obols should be given for a stater. In this way, they clipped off 1/6 of each gold coin possessed by the people. By licensing monopolies of nearly all kinds of wares, these rulers daily oppressed the purchasers. The sale of clothes was the only thing they left untouched, and even in this case they contrived the following scheme. Cloaks of silk had long been made in Berytus and Tyre. In Phoenicia, merchants who dwelt in these, and all the artisans and workers connected with the trade, had settled there in early times, and from these cities this trade had spread throughout the earth. But during the reign of Justinian, those in this business at Constantinople and in other cities raised the price of these garments, claiming that the price for such stuffs had been raised by the Persians, and that the import duties to Roman territory were also higher. The emperor, pretending to be incensed at this, proclaimed by edict that such clothing could not be sold for more than 8 gold coins a pound, and the punishment for disobeying this law was the confiscation of the transgressor's property. This seemed to everybody impossible and futile, for it was not practicable for the merchants who imported silk at a higher price to sell it to their customers for less. Consequently, they decided to stop dealing in it at all, and privately got rid of their present stock as best they could, selling it to such notables as took pleasure in throwing away their money for such finery, or thought they had to wear it. The empress, hearing what was going on through her whispering spies, without stopping to verify the rumor, immediately confiscated these persons' wares, fining them a centenary in addition. Now the imperial treasurer is to be in charge of all matters connected with this trade. So when Peter Barsiames was given that office, they soon left it to him to do their unholy deeds. He ruled that all should obey the letter of the law, while he ordered the silk makers to work for himself. And this was no secret, for he sold colored silk in the forum at 6 gold pieces an ounce, while for the imperial dye, which is known as holover, he charged more than 24. In this way he got much money for the emperor and more quietly for himself, and the custom he started continues to this day, the treasurer being admittedly the sole silk merchant and controller of this trade. The former dealers in silk in Constantinople and every other city, by sea and by land, were naturally heavily damaged. Almost the whole populace in the cities mentioned were suddenly made beggars. Artisans and mechanics were forced to struggle against famine, and many consequently left the country and fled to Persia. Only the imperial treasurer could transact this business, giving a share of the profits aforesaid to the emperor, and himself taking most of them, fattening on the public calamity, and so much for that. How he spoiled the beauty of the cities and plundered the poor. How he ruined the beauty and appearance of Constantinople and every other city we shall now see. First, he determined to debase the standing of the lawyers. He deprived them of all court fees by which they had formerly lived in comfort and elegance, and in consequence they lost caste and significance. And after he had confiscated the estates of the senators and other prosperous people, as has been related in Constantinople and all over the Roman Empire, there was little use for lawyers anyway. Men no longer had anything worth mentioning to go to court about. So, of all the many noted advocates, only a few were left, and they were despised and reduced to penury, reaping nothing but insult from their work. Furthermore, he caused physicians and teachers of the liberal arts to be deprived of the necessities of life, for he stopped all their living subsidies, which former emperors had paid men of these professions from the public treasury. Also, all the taxes which the municipalities had devoted to public use or entertainments he transferred arbitrarily to the imperial treasury. No consideration was now given to any physician or teacher. No one dared pay any attention to public buildings. There were no public lights in any city, nor any entertainments for the citizens, for the theaters, hippodromes, and circuses in which his wife had been born, bred, and educated were all discontinued. Later, he even stopped the public spectacles in Constantinople to avoid spending the usual state money on them, by which an almost incalculable number of people had got their livelihood. On these individually and collectively, ruin and desuetude descended, and as if some cataclysm had fallen on them from heaven, their happiness was slain, and no other subject was spoken of among men and no other subject was spoken of among men at home or in public in the churches than their calamities, their sufferings, and their overwhelming by the latest misfortune. Such was the state of affairs in the cities. Of what is left to tell, this is worth mentioning. Each year 2 Roman consuls were appointed, one at Rome, the other at Constantinople. And whoever was called to this honor was expected to spend more than 20 gold centenaries on the public, some of which came from the consul's private purse, but most was furnished by the emperor. This money was given to those others whom I have mentioned, but mostly to the poor and those employed in the theater, all of which was to the good of the city. But from the time Justinian came to power, these distributions were not made at the customary time. And for sometimes a consul remained in office for year after year, till finally people wearied of hoping for a new one, even in their dreams. As a result, universal poverty was the case, since the usual annual relief was no longer afforded to subjects, and in every way all that they had was taken from them by their ruler. Now I think I have shown sufficiently how this destroyer devoured all the public moneys and robbed each member of the Senate publicly and privately of all his estates, and how by bringing false charges he confiscated the properties of everybody else who was reputed to be wealthy. I imagine I have adequately told, as in the case of the soldiers, subordinate officers, and the palace guard, the farmers and landowners, those whose businesses in words, merchants, ship owners and sailors, mechanics, artisans, and market dealers, those whose livelihood is in the theater, and indeed everyone else who was affected in turn by the damage done to these. And now let us see what he did to those in need of alms, the poor, the beggars, and the diseased. For what he did to the priests will be described later. First, as I have said, he took control of all the shops, licensed monopolies of all the wares most necessary to life, and exacted a price of more than triple their worth from the citizens. And other details of what he did I would not even attempt to catalog in an endless book, since they were simply uncountable. He put a bitter and perpetual tax on the sale of bread, which the day laborers, the poor and the infirm, could not help buying. From this source he demanded 3 centenaries a year, with the result that the bakers filled their loaves with shells and dust, for the emperor had no scruples against profiting meanly from even this unholy adulteration. Those in charge of the markets, turning this trick to their private gain with ease, became very wealthy and reduced the poor to an unexpected famine, even in prosperous times. Since it was not permitted to bring in grain from other places, but all were forced to eat bread purchased in the city. One of the municipal aqueducts, which furnished not a small share of the city water, collapsed, but the rulers disregarded the matter and refused to repair it. Though the constant crowds who had to use the wells were fairly stifling, and all the baths were shut down. On the other hand, he threw away great sums of money senselessly on buildings by the seashore and elsewhere in all the suburbs, as if the palaces in which all the former emperors had been content to dwell were not enough for this pair. So it was not to save money, but to destroy his subjects, that he refused to rebuild the aqueduct. For no one in all history had ever been born among men more eager than Justinian to get hold of money and then to throw it immediately away again. Oh my God, this guy. Through the two things left of them to drink and eat, water and bread, this emperor injured those who were in the last extremes of poverty, making the one hard to procure at all and the other too expensive to buy. This he did not only to the poor in Constantinople, but to inhabitants elsewhere, as I shall now relate. When Theodoric captured Italy, he permitted the palace guard to remain in Rome, that some trace of the ancient state might be left, and he continued their daily pay. These soldiers were quite numerous, comprising the Senentiarii, the domestics, and the student corps, who were soldiers only in name. Their pay was just enough to live on, and Theodoric ordered that this should revert on their deaths to their children and families. Among the poor who lived near the church of St. Peter the Apostle, he distributed each year 3,000 bushels of grain from the public granary, which they continued to receive until the arrival in Italy of Alexander the Caesars. This man immediately decided to deprive them of all this. When Justinian, emperor of the Romans, learned of this economy, he was greatly pleased and favored Alexander more than ever. It was on his way here that Alexander treated the Greeks as follows. The fortress at Thermopylae had long been guarded by the neighboring farmers, who took turns watching the wall whenever an incursion of barbarians to the Peloponnese was anticipated. But this Alexander, when he arrived there, claimed it was to the advantage of the Peloponnesians not to allow this pass to be kept by farmers. So he stationed 2,000 soldiers there, to be paid not out of the imperial treasury, but by all the cities of Greece. And on this pretext he diverted all their public and entertainment revenues to the general fund, saying that from it food would be bought for these soldiers. In consequence, after this, everywhere in Greece, including even Athens, no public buildings or any other benefit could be considered. But Justinian, of course, approved this action of the Caesars, and that is what happened here. Then there is the matter of the poor in Alexandria. Among the lawyers there was one Hephaestus, who, on being made governor of Alexandria, put a stop to civic sedition by intimidating the rioters, but reduced all the inhabitants to the utmost misery. For he immediately brought all the wares in the city under a monopoly, forbidding other merchants to sell anything, and himself became the only dealer and sole vendor of all wares, fixing prices as he pleased under his supreme power. By the consequent shortage in necessary provisions, the city of Alexandria was greatly distressed. Where formerly even the very poor had been able to live adequately, and the high price of bread pinched them most. For he alone bought up all the grain in Egypt, not allowing anyone else to purchase as much as a single bushel, and thus he controlled the supply and price of bread as he pleased. In this way he soon amassed unheard of wealth, at the same time satisfying the greed of the emperor. The people of Alexandria, through fear of Hephaestus, bore their suffering in silence, and the emperor, awed by the abundance of money that continually came to him from that quarter, was wonderfully delighted with his governor. This Hephaestus, planning to incur even greater favor of the emperor, contrived the following additional scheme. When Diocletian became ruler of the Romans, he ordered a large quantity of grain to be given yearly to the poor in Alexandria, and the Alexandrians, distributing this among themselves at that time, had transmitted the right to receive this bounty to their descendants up to this time. But Hephaestus, depriving these needy ones of this charity, which amounted to 2,000,000 bushels, diverted it to the imperial granary, and wrote to the emperor that these men had been getting this dole unjustly and not in accordance with the interests of state. The emperor, approving this action, was still fonder of him than before, but such Alexandrians, whose hope of life had been in the distribution in their present bitter distress, felt the full benefit of his inhumanity. 27. how the defender of the faith protected the interests of the Christians. The deeds of Justinian were such that all eternity would not be long enough in which to describe them adequately. A few examples will have to suffice to illuminate his whole character to future generations. What a dissembler he was, how he disregarded God, the priests, the laws, and the people who showed themselves loyal to him. He had no shame at all. Either when he brought destruction on the state or at any misdeed, he did not bother to try to excuse his actions, and his only care was how he might get sole possession of all the wealth in the world. To begin, as Bishop of Alexandria, he appointed a man by the name of Paul. At this time, one Rhodon, a Phoenician, was governor of that city. Him he ordered to serve Paul with all zeal and follow and allow none of his instructions to be unfulfilled, for thus he thought he could associate all the priests in Alexandria under the synod of Chalcedon. Now, there was a certain Arsenius, a native of Palestine, who had become one of the most useful intimates of the Empress Theodora, and consequently, after acquiring great power and wealth, had been raised to senatorial rank, though he was a disgusting fellow. He was a Samaritan, but so as not to lose his official rank and power, became a nominal Christian, while his father and brother, encouraged by his authority, continued in their ancestral faith in Scythopolis, where, with his consent, they persecuted the Christians intolerably. As a result of this, the citizens revolted and put them both to a most shameful death. Many later troubles afflicted the people of Palestine because of this. At the time, however, neither Justinian nor the empress did anything to punish Arsenius, although he was principally responsible for the whole trouble. They merely forbade him entrance to the palace to get rid of the crowds of Christians complaining against him. This Arsenius, thinking to please the emperor, soon went to Alexandria with Paul to assist him generally, and in special to help him get the goodwill of the Alexandrians. For during the time he had been barred from the palace, he affirmed he had become learned in all the Christian doctrines. This displeased Theodora, for she pretended to disagree with the emperor in religious matters, as I have told before. As soon as they arrived in Alexandria, Paul handed over a deacon by the name of Pisoes to Rhodon to be put to death on the charge that this man alone stood in the way of the accomplishment of the emperor's wishes. And following instructions and letters from the emperor, which came frequently and cogently, Rhodon ordered the man to be scourged, after which, while he was being racked by the torture, he up and died. When news of this reached the emperor, at the empress's instigation, he expressed horror at what had been done by Paul, Rhodon, and Arsenius, as if he had forgotten his own instructions to these men. He now appointed Liberius, a patrician from Rome, governor of Alexandria, and sent certain priests of good reputation to Alexandria to investigate the matter. Among these were the archdeacon of Rome, Pelagius, who was commissioned by Pope Vigilius to act as his legate. Paul, convicted of the murder, was removed from the bishopric. Rhodon, who fled to Constantinople, was beheaded by the emperor, and his estates confiscated, although the man produced 13 letters which the emperor had written him, insisting and commanding him to serve Paul in everything and never to oppose him, so that he could fulfill his every wish in religious matters. Liberius, at Theodora's order, crucified Arsenius, and the emperor confiscated his property, though he had no charge to bring against him, except that he had been an intimate with Paul. Now, whether his actions in this matter were just or otherwise, I cannot say, but I shall soon show why I have described the affair. Some time later, Paul came to Constantinople and offered the emperor 7 gold centenaries if he would reinstate him in the holy office, from which he claimed he had been illegally removed. Justinian genially took the money, treated the man with great respect, and agreed to make him bishop of Alexandria again very soon, though another now held the office, as if he did not know that he himself had put to death Paul's friends and helpers and had confiscated their estates. So the Augustus zealously attended every effort to arrange this matter, and Paul was generally expected to regain his bishopric one way or another. But Vigilius, who was in the capital at the time, decided not to yield to the emperor's command in such a case, and he said he could not annul a decision which Pelagius had given as his legate. And the emperor, whose only idea was to get the money, dismissed the matter. Here's another similar case. There was a certain Faustin, born in Palestine and of an old Samaritan family, who accepted a nominal Christianity when the law constrained him. This Faustin became a senator and a governor of his province, and when his term of office expired a little later, he came to Constantinople, where he was denounced by certain priests as having favored the Samaritans and impiously persecuted the Christians in Palestine. Justinian appeared to be very angry and outraged that during his rule over the Romans, anybody could have insulted the name of Christ. So the Senate investigated the affair, and by the will of the emperor punished Faustin with exile. But the emperor, after getting from him the money he wanted, straightway annulled the decree, and Faustin, restored to his former rank and the emperor's friendship, was made count of the imperial domains in Palestine and Phoenicia, where he fearlessly did as much harm as he wanted. Now, in what way Justinian protected the true interest of the Christians may be clearly seen in these instances, few of them as I have had time to give. 28 is violation of the laws of the Romans and how Jews were fined for eating lamb. How he unhesitatingly abolished laws when money was in question will now be shown in a few words. There was one Priscus of the city of Emesa, who was a skillful forger of others' handwriting and a rare artist in such crime. It happened that the church of Emesa had a long time before inherited the property of a distinguished patrician named Mammian, of illustrious family and of great wealth. During Justinian's reign, Priscus inventoried all the families of the mentioned city so as to find which were adequately rich to be worth plundering. And after he investigated their family history and found ancient letters in their ancestors' handwriting, he forged the documents purporting to be their agreements to pay to Mammian large sums of money which were supposed to have been left with them by him as a deposit. The amount of money mentioned as an obligation in these forgeries was not less than 100 gold centenaries. He also imitated very craftily the writing of certain notary a certain notary public, whose office was in the forum during Mammian's lifetime. A man of high reputation for truth and every other virtue, who used to draw up all the citizens' documents, fixing them with his own seal. To those who were in charge of ecclesiastical affairs at Emesa, he gave these documents after they agreed that he would get a share of the money to be obtained from the matter. But since there was a statute of limitations barring action after 30 years, except in mortgages and certain other matters where the limit was 40 years, they formed the following plan. Going to Constantinople and offering the emperor large sums of money, they begged him to join in the accomplishing the destruction of their innocent fellow citizens. He took the money and without scruple published a new law to the effect that the statute of limitations did not apply to the church, but claims connected with that institution might be brought at any time within 100 years, and this was now the law not only in Emesa but throughout the whole Roman Empire. To enforce his decree, he sent to Emesa one Longinus, a man of deeds and of great bodily strength, who later was prefect of Constantinople. And those in charge of church affairs were immediately brought suit for 2 centenaries against some of the citizens whose ancestors were mentioned in the forgeries, and soon obtained judgments against these men, who had no defense owing to the great lapse of time and their ignorance of the facts. And all the other citizens were greatly grieved over this and incensed against the accusers, the most reputable men of Emesa being the most perturbed. Just as this evil was now progressing against the majority of the citizens, Providence intervened in the following way. Longinus ordered Priscus, the inventor of the mischievous trick, to bring him all the documents in the case, and when he objected, slapped him with all his might. Priscus, unable to bear the shock of a blow from a strong man, fell on his back, now trembling and shaking with fear, and supposing that Longinus had discovered him and that the whole deceit had been brought to light, stopped bringing suits. As if it were not enough to do away with the laws of the Romans daily, the emperor also exerted himself to destroy the tradition of the Jews. For whenever their calendar Passover came before the Christian Easter, he forbade the Jews to celebrate it on their proper day, to make then any sacrifices to God or perform any of their customs. Many of them were heavily fined by the magistrates for eating lamb at such times, as if this were against the laws of the state. Knowing countless other such acts of Justinian, I cannot include them, since the end of the book draws near, In any case, what I have told will be enough to show the nature of the man. 29. Other incidents revealing him as a liar and a hypocrite. I will now show what a liar and a hypocrite he was. This Liberius, whom I recently mentioned, he removed from office, and in his stead appointed John, an Egyptian, surnamed Laxarian. When Pelagius, a particular friend of Liberius's, heard of this, he asked the emperor if the report about Laxarian's appointment were true, and he immediately denied it, assuring him that he had done nothing of the sort, and gave him a letter to take to Liberius, charging him to stick tight to his office and give it over to nobody, as he, Justinian, had not the slightest idea of removing him from it at this time. Now, John had an uncle in Constantinople named Eudaemon, of consular rank and great wealth, who was at the time count of the imperial estates. This Eudaemon, when he heard of the rumor, also went to the emperor to inquire if the office were really going to his nephew. And Justinian, in contradiction of what he had written to Liberius, now wrote a document to John, telling him to take over the office by all means, as his intentions were unchanged. John, trusting this instruction, ordered Liberius to retire from his office, as he had been officially removed. But Liberius, with equal confidence, of course, in the letter he had from the emperor, refused. So John went to Liberius with an armed guard, and Liberius with his own guard defended himself. During the fight, many were killed, including John himself, the new governor. Now, at Eudaemon's instigation, Liberius was summoned to Constantinople. The Senate investigated the affair and acquitted Liberius, since what he did had been in self-defense. The emperor, however, did not let him off until he had privately paid him a fine. This shows Justinian's love of truth and how he kept his word. It might not be out of the way for me to tell a sequel of this incident. This Eudaemon died a little later, leaving many relatives but no will of any kind. About the same time, the chief eunuch of the palace, Euphrates, was released from life, leaving a nephew but no will, disposing of his considerable property. The emperor seized both estates, making himself the arbitrary heir, and did not give as much as a 3-obol piece to the legal inheritors. Such was the respect for law and the kinsmen of his friends that this emperor had. So also he seized the estate of Irenaeus, who had died some time before, without any proper claim to it of any kind. Another thing that happened at this time I must also not fail to tell. One, Anatolius was foremost in the Senate of Ascalon. His daughter was married to a citizen of Caesarea by the name of Mamilian, of illustrious family. This girl was Anatolius's legal heir, since she was his only child. Now there was an ancient law that when a senator of any of the cities departed the world, leaving no male issue, 1/4 of his estate should go to the senate of his city, and all the rest to his heirs. Here again the tyrant had showed his true character. He made a new law reversing the rule, decreeing that when a senator died without male issue, his heirs should get 1/4 of his estate, and all the rest should go to the imperial treasury and the local senate. Never in the memory of man had the treasury or the emperor shared the estate of a senator. While this new law was in force, Anatolius reached the final day of his life. His daughter was about to divide her inheritance with the treasury and the city senate according to the law, when she received letters from both the emperor and the Ascalon Senate dismissing all their claims to the property on the ground that they had already all that was properly their just due. Later, Mamilian also died, Anatolius' son-in-law, leaving one daughter, who, of course, inherited his estate. While her mother was still living, this daughter too died after marrying a man of distinction by whom she had no children, male or female. Justinian immediately seized the whole estate, on the remarkable ground that it would be an unholy thing for the daughter of Anatolius, an old woman, to become rich on the property of both her father and her husband. But that the woman might not be reduced to beggary, he ordered her to be given 1 gold stater a day, so long as she lived, writing in the decree by which he robbed her of these properties, that he was granting her this stater for the sake of religion, for it is my custom to do what is holy and pious. This will have to suffice in order that my book may not be overfilled with such anecdotes, and indeed no one man could recall everything he did. I will show how he cared nothing for even the blues who were devoted to him when money was at stake. There was a Cilician named Malthanes, son-in-law of Leo, who was, as I have said, a referendar. Justinian sent this Malthanes to restore order among the Cilicians. On this pretext, Malthanes inflicted intolerable sufferings on most of his fellow citizens and robbed them of their money, some of which he sent to the tyrant, enriching himself unjustly with the rest. Now some bore their sufferings in silence, but those of the inhabitants of Tarsus, who were blues, trusting in the favor of the empress, assembled in their forum to insult Malthanes, who was not present. When Malthanes heard of this, he assembled a body of soldiers and arrived in Tarsus by night, and sending his soldiers into the private houses, ordered them to put the inhabitants to death. Thinking this was an invasion by the enemy, the blues defended themselves, and among other evils that took place in the darkness, it happened that Damian, a senator, was killed by an arrow wound. This Damian was president of the local blues, and when the news came to Constantinople, the indignant blues there made a great uproar throughout the city, and gathered in crowds to complain violently to the emperor, while they uttered terrible threats against Leo and Malthanes. The emperor pretended to be no less outraged at the affair, and immediately wrote to order an investigation and punishment of Malthanes by his citizens. But Leo gave him a large sum of money, so he stopped inquiry and his interest in the blues. With the affair thus unsettled, the emperor received Malthanes at Constantinople with all favor and esteem. As he was leaving the imperial presence, the blues, who had been on the lookout for him, attacked him in the very palace and would have killed him if some of their party who had been bribed by Leo had not stopped them. Who would not call that state most miserable, in which the emperor accepts bribes to leave an inquiry unfinished, and in which factionists, while the emperor is in the palace, dare to mutiny against one of their own magistrates and lift violent hands against him? However, no punishment for this was ever brought on either Malthanes or those who attacked him. And from this alone, if you pleased, you could prove the character of Justinian. 30 further innovations of Justinian and Theodora, and a conclusion. How much he cared for the interest of the state may be seen by what he did to the public couriers and the spies for the preceding Roman emperors, so that they might most quickly and easily have news of enemy invasions into any province, of sedition in any of the cities, or any other unexpected trouble of the actions of the governors and everyone else everywhere in the Roman Empire, and also so that those bringing in annual taxes might be kept from delay and danger. Had established a system of public couriers everywhere in the following manner. As a day's journey for an active man, they decided on 8 stages in some places, in others less, but hardly ever less than 5. 40 horses were kept for each stage, and grooms in proportion to the number of horses. By frequent relays of the best mounts, couriers were thus able to ride as long a distance in one day as would ordinarily require 10, and bring with them the news required. Also, the landowners in these provinces, especially those whose estates were in the interior, were greatly benefited by the system, as they sold at a high price to the government each year their surplus harvest to feed the horses and the grooms. And accordingly, the state received the due tribute from each of these, immediately reimbursing them for furnishing it. And this was to the advantage of the whole state. Now, this is how things were formerly done. But this tyrant first suppressed the post from Chalcedon to Decibiza, and then compelled the couriers to go from Constantinople to Helenopolis, however little they liked it, by sea, faring in small boats, such as were usually used for crossing the strait. They were in serious peril if a storm came up, for because speed was demanded of them, they could not wait for calm weather. In the case of the road to Persia, he permitted the former system to remain, but everywhere else in the east, as far as Egypt, he reduced the number of stages, making a day's journey to one, and provided instead of horses a few asses. Consequently, news of what happened in each province was brought with great difficulty, too late to be of any use, long after the event, and the farm owners got no benefit of their crops, which were either rotted or lay idle. The spies were organized as follows. Many men were formally supported by the treasury, who visited the enemy, especially the Persian court, to find out exactly what was going on. On their return to Roman territory, they were able to report to the emperors the secrets of the enemy, and the Romans, being warned, were on guard and could not be taken by surprise. This system was also a long-established custom with the Medes and Khosrows. They say increased the pay of his spies and benefited by the precaution. But Justinian did away with the practice of hiring Roman spies, and in consequence lost much territory to the enemy, including Lazica, which was taken because the Romans had no information as to where the Persian king was with his army. The state had also always kept a large number of camels, which carried all the baggage when the Roman army marched against the foe. Thus the peasants did not have to carry burdens, and the soldiers lacked no necessity. But Justinian did away with almost all of these animals. Consequently, when the Roman army now marches against an enemy, it is impossible for it to be supplied with what it needs. Such was the zeal he displayed for the interest of the state. There is nothing like mentioning one of his ridiculous acts. Among the lawyers at Caesarea was one Evangelius, a man of no mean distinction, who, favored by the winds of fate, became the master of much money and much land. Eventually, he bought a village on the seacoast named Porphyrion for 3 gold centenaries. Learning of this, Justinian immediately took the place from him, giving him back only a small fraction of the price he had paid, and uttered the remark that it would never do for Evangelius, a mere lawyer, to be the lord of such a village. Well, we must stop somewhere when we begin to recall these stories. This, however, is worth telling. Among the innovations of Justinian Theodora, formerly when the Senate approached the emperor, it paid homage in the following manner. Every patrician kissed him on the right breast. The emperor kissed the patrician on the head, and he was dismissed. Then the rest bent their right knee to the emperor and withdrew. It was not customary to pay homage to the queen. But those who were admitted to the presence of Justinian and Theodora, whether they were patricians or otherwise, fell on their faces on the floor, stretching their hands and feet out wide, kissed first one foot, then the other of the Augustus, and then retired. Nor did Theodora refuse this honor, and she even received the ambassadors of the Persians and other barbarians and gave them presents as if she were in command of the Roman Empire, a thing that had never happened in all previous time. And formerly, intimates of the emperor called him emperor and the empress, and the other officials according to the title of their rank. But if anybody addressed either of these two as emperor or empress without adding your majesty or your highness, or forgot to call himself their slave, he was considered either ignorant or insolent, and was dismissed in disgrace as if he had done some awful crime or committed an unpardonable sin. And before, only a few were sometimes admitted to the palace, but from the time when these two came to power, the magistrates and everybody else had no trouble in fairly living in the palace. This was because the magistrates of old had administered justice and the laws according to their conscience, and made their decisions while in their own offices, while their subjects, neither seeing nor hearing any justice, of course, had little cause to trouble the emperor. But these two, taking control of everything to the misfortune of their subjects, forced everyone to come to them and beg like slaves, and almost any day one could see the law courts nearly deserted, while in the hall of the emperor there was a jostling and pushing crowd that resembled nothing so much as a mob of slaves. Those who were supposed to be in the imperial favor would stand there all day and most of the night, sleepless and foodless, until they were exhausted, and this is what their presumed good fortune got them. And those who were free of all this sort of thing asked each other what would become of the prosperity of the Romans, for some were sure that it was already in the hands of the barbarians, and others said the emperor had hidden it away in his various dwelling places. But only when Justinian, be he man or king of the devils, shall have departed this life, shall they who then happen to survive him discover the truth. Wow. Okay. But only when Justinian, be he man or king of the devil, shall have departed this life, shall they who then happen to survive him discover the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the shocking, debilitating, demoralizing Anecdota of Procopius. Join us again next time when we experience more amazing stuff. Until then, goodbye.